The sun was just rising over the Texas prairie when the smell hit them: slow-roasted meat, hickory smoke, something rich and impossible. Italian prisoners of war, still groggy from a night behind barbed wire, stopped in their tracks. A few blinked hard, as if hallucinating. One muttered, "Dio mio?" It was real. Outside the camp's perimeter, on unauthorized soil, stood a grizzled American cowboy in worn-out jeans, tending a makeshift smoker. The guards were shouting, but the smell had already breached the wire. His name was Roy Lancer. No rank, no orders, just a rancher with a stubborn streak and a heart full of contradiction. When he saw the prisoners watching, he tipped his hat. Then, to everyone's shock, he motioned them over. "Y'all hungry?" he asked, grinning. What happened next wasn't regulation. It wasn't war. But it was something else entirely. As the men bit into that first smoky rib, something shifted. By sundown, the prisoners were asking not to escape, but to stay. Before that Texas sunset, before the meat and smoke, there was only surrender. The desert wind in North Africa was sharp with sand and shame when the Italian soldiers laid down their arms. It was early spring of 1943, and the campaign had collapsed. Their commanders vanished into the dust or into British custody. For the men who had survived the bombing, the heat, and the hunger, the end came not with a bullet, but with silence. Some cried, some knelt. Most stood blankly, squinting toward an uncertain future as American and British forces herded them into open-air holding yards near Tunis. They were not monsters. They were cooks, masons, bakers, teachers, farmers, men who had been conscripted, fed slogans and sawdust bread, and now stood stripped of certainty, waiting for a fate none of them understood. The ships came fast, rusted gray hulls that loomed like nightmares, swallowing the men by the thousands. They were told nothing. Some thought they were being taken to Europe. Others whispered of prison labor camps in South America. But none guessed Texas. The journey took weeks. Packed into belly holds, they dozed in shifts, sweating in canvas hammocks and metal bunks stacked high and swaying with the waves. The food was edible, the guards indifferent, and the ocean seemed to go on forever. When land finally reappeared, it was not Rome or Cairo. It was the bristle of pine trees and strange bird song and the vast, unrecognizable skyline of New Orleans. From there, they were loaded onto trains. Long black engines that hissed and groaned as they barreled westward through the heart of a country none of the men had ever imagined seeing. Through Louisiana's swampy lowlands, into Arkansas's hills, and then Texas. The landscape opened like a wound, endless grasslands under a sky so wide it made some of them dizzy. Herds of cattle wandered near the tracks. Small towns blinked past, sleepy and sunburned. Women in bonnets hung laundry on lines, children rode bicycles, and church steeples pointed into clouds that didn't look like war. One man, a former schoolteacher from Naples, pressed his forehead to the glass and whispered, "This can't be the enemy's country. It's too alive." The camps were not as they had feared. Rows of wooden barracks behind barbed wire, yes. Guard towers, yes. But no snarling dogs, no screaming, no beatings. They were marched off the trains under watchful eyes, and for a few minutes the tension in the air was so thick it felt like smoke. But then they were given water. Then names were called, groups formed. The sun was hot, the earth dry, and everywhere the smell of hay, horses, and something cooking, a scent they couldn't place. For many, it was their first inhale of mesquite. They were assigned bunks. Some received new clothes. The American guards spoke English, sometimes Spanish. Their faces were unreadable. The Italians braced for cruelty, but it didn't come. Instead came routine: roll call, meals on trays, letters from the Red Cross. One prisoner, a bricklayer from Palermo, found himself stunned by the sheer order of it all. He said nothing, only stared at the clean floors, the painted fences, the electric lights inside the barracks. This was not what he had been told, not what the posters had said. His country was in ruin, and here, in enemy hands. The toilets flushed, the beds were dry. The first night, a few men cried, quietly under the covers so the others wouldn't hear, but not from fear, from relief, from exhaustion, from the simple realization that they were still alive and that, somehow, their captivity had delivered them into a world that made more sense than the one that had taken them from their homes. And that was before they met the cowboy. His name was Roy Lancer, and long before the war ever touched Texas soil, Roy had been known for two things: riding broncs and smoking meat. He had busted his hip in a rodeo back in '29, walked with a limp ever since, and never quite took to the idea of fences, not literal ones, not political ones, not the kind that separated men just because some officers said they were enemies. He owned about 80 acres that ran up close to the northern edge of the camp's outer wire, land his daddy had cleared with his bare hands and a stubborn mule. Roy still wore the same hat his daddy had given him, stained with sweat and patched at the crown. And if you asked him what he thought of the war, he'd spit once, lean on the fence post and say, "Damn lot of boys dying in a pissing match that don't smell like freedom to me." He wasn't a talker, but he watched, and what he saw, day after day, troubled him. The prisoners, young Italian men with dust on their boots and sunburn on their necks, moved in lines behind the wire like ghosts. They weren't soldiers anymore, just men, farm boys, most of them. Same calluses, same tan lines, same quiet looks when they passed the fields. Roy could tell just by how they glanced at the soil through the wire. They missed it. You don't fake that kind of longing. He saw it in the way they stared at his cattle, at the old windmill, even at his boots. They didn't hate him. They were just somewhere else. The first time he approached the fence, it wasn't planned. He was stringing wire near the back pasture when he heard singing. Not in English, some old tune, mournful, like river water moving slow through reeds. He walked closer, squinting. A group of them were working the camp garden, their voices low, harmonizing without effort. One of them looked up, met his eyes. Just for a second. Roy tipped his hat. The boy nodded once. Neither smiled. But something passed between them, weightless and old. That night, Roy didn't sleep. Next morning, he hitched the old smoker to his truck and drove it down near the back fence. No permits, no calls. He just parked it like it belonged there. Cut wood from the pecan tree near his barn, hauled out a slab of brisket big as a saddle, seasoned it with salt, pepper, and cayenne, no sugar, no sauce. He lit the fire, fed the smoke, and let the scent drift where it wanted. He didn't say a word the first day, just cooked. But they noticed. By noon, every Italian near that section of the fence had found a reason to linger. They worked slower. Looked up more often. Some crossed themselves. Others closed their eyes and just breathed. Roy leaned back against the tailgate, arms folded, and watched the smoke curl upward like a signal. When the guards came by, he nodded politely, said he was smoking meat for a church supper. They didn't press. They rarely did with Roy. He was local, old school, and besides, half of them had eaten his ribs at the 4th of July picnic the year before. But Roy wasn't cooking for church folks. By the third day, he brought folding chairs. By the 5th, he dragged out a second brisket. And on the 7th, when one of the prisoners slipped a hand through the wire, palm upturned like it weighed 1,000 pounds, Roy handed him a bone with meat still clinging to it. That was the moment. It wasn't law, it wasn't right by military standards. But it was human. That boy took the rib in both hands, stared at it like it was treasure, then bit, and closed his eyes. Roy watched him chew, slow and silent, tears welling. No words passed between them, just the smoke and the fence, and the understanding that somewhere between the two, something had changed. Roy knew then he'd be back tomorrow, with more firewood, more meat, and maybe, God help him, a stack of paper plates. He didn't ask permission, he just showed up again, sunrise to smoke. By the 2nd week, Roy had started setting a rhythm. Sundays, always Sundays. That was the day the guards were laziest, when inspections thinned and nobody really wanted to sweat through enforcing protocols. Roy would roll in with his old pickup, dragging the barrel smoker, already hissing with oak and mesquite. By now, the Italians knew. They watched the horizon for the dust plume from his truck. Some swore they could smell him before they saw him. The first time Roy stepped too close to the fence, one of the guards barked at him. "You can't feed prisoners, Roy." He just tipped his hat and said, "Ain't feedin' prisoners, feedin' men." That earned him a written warning. The camp commander called him in, gave him a polite but firm reprimand, citing Geneva rules, military decorum, national security. Roy just nodded, listened, then the next Sunday showed up again. Brisket, ribs, links, a loaf of cornbread he'd baked himself, and 3 hand-carved spoons he left in the dirt by the fence, wrapped in wax paper. Eventually the guards stopped stopping him. It wasn't sanctioned, but it wasn't stopped. The first time he motioned them across the line, no one moved. The Italians stood, frozen, hands half raised, eyes darting from Roy to the guard towers. Then, slowly, one stepped forward. Barely 20 years old, lean and silent, with dark eyes that carried too many memories. Roy watched him come, one hesitant step at a time, until they stood an arm's length apart, the fence between them. Roy didn't speak, just reached out, through the gap, holding a smoked rib. The boy took it. He didn't eat it, not right away. He just held it there, the way a starving man might hold a photograph of bread. He looked at it like it was holy. Then he bit, and as the fat hit his tongue, something broke. His shoulders shook. He lowered himself slowly to the ground and began to cry. Behind him, others stepped forward. By sundown, Roy had passed ribs, sausages, and peach cobbler through the wire. One of the older prisoners brought him a folded napkin with 2 chestnuts inside. Another sang a song, voice cracked with emotion, a lullaby Roy didn't understand but felt in his bones. They didn't speak the same language, but none of it needed words. The food said enough. The ritual was born: smoke, meat, exchange. Every week the line blurred just a little more. The fence still stood, but the idea of it, the separation it was meant to enforce, began to crumble. Soon the men would gather near the back stretch of the camp before sunrise. They'd bring tokens, a sketch of Roy drawn on scrap paper, a prayer carved into wood, a jar of olives someone had managed to save. One even gave Roy a rosary. The cowboy hung it on the rearview mirror of his truck and never took it down. They stopped calling him the American, started calling him Il Cuoco, the cook, and Roy, for his part, started learning their names. Not all, just a few. Marco, Johnny, Tommaso, the ones who came first, who stood closest. He asked about their families, their towns. He told them, in broken phrases and hand motions, about the cattle he raised, the wife he'd buried, the land he'd inherited, and worked alone since. They listened, nodded, told him about fig trees, pasta, wine, mothers, and the hills of Sicily or the streets of Bologna. War faded from the air. What replaced it was memory and smoke. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city or country in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. If you're enjoying this story, hit the like button, then tap subscribe just beneath the video. And make sure to click the bell so you never miss a story like this. Every click helps us keep sharing moments like Roy's BBQ, moments the history books forgot, but that changed lives forever. Back at the fence, Roy watched one of the boys bite into a smoked sausage and close his eyes like he was dreaming. "What is this place?" one of them asked softly. Not to Roy, not to anyone in particular. No one answered, but everyone felt the same question, rising like heat from the pit. Whatever this place was, it no longer felt like prison. The mornings still began with roll call, and the fences still stood tall, coiled with barbed wire and guarded by riflemen in watchtowers. But something had shifted, subtly, then unmistakably. The guards no longer barked, the prisoners no longer marched, and somewhere between smoke and sausage, the line between captor and captive began to soften like slow-cooked meat pulled from the bone. The camp was still a war zone on paper, but in the hearts of those inside it had become something stranger, a kind of limbo suspended between punishment and peace. It started with singing, not in defiance, but out of memory. One evening after supper, a group of Italians gathered near the barracks and began humming a folk song. It was a tune about home, about olive trees, barefoot children, and warm bread pulled from clay ovens. The melody curled through the air like a prayer, and nobody stopped it. A few guards, leaning against the mess hall wall, listened quietly. One of them tapped the rhythm on his thigh. By the next week, a harmonica had appeared, then a battered guitar. No one knew where they came from, maybe traded, maybe gifted, maybe smuggled in through a blind eye. But the music didn't stop. It became routine. In the evenings, the camp filled with voices, not cries or orders, but harmony. Italian lullabies, American bluegrass, even a clumsy, joyful rendition of "You Are My Sunshine," sung in broken accents and perfect spirit. The guards, many of them no older than the prisoners, began joining in. They taught the Italians words like cowpoke, brisket, honky-tonk, laughing as the prisoners mangled the syllables. In return, the Italians offered them nicknames: Ciccio for the round-faced sergeant, Angelo for the lanky guard with soft eyes. Soon there were inside jokes, shared meals, even sketches. One prisoner carved a chess set from soap and wood. Another painted portraits of the guards using crushed berries for pigment and coffee grounds for shading. Roy's Sunday BBQs had become more than tradition. They were sacred. But inside the wire, life bloomed in strange ways. Letters came in from families in Sicily, Naples, and Florence, some tattered, some stained with salt tears. The Red Cross delivered books, and a few of the Americans set up impromptu English classes. One of the guards, a former schoolteacher from Missouri, taught vocabulary from the back of ration boxes. Knife, fork, freedom, words that carried weight in every syllable. But not everyone approved. Tension crept along the edges of the fence like weeds after rain. One guard, new to the rotation, spat when he heard the singing. "They're Nazis," he snapped. "Don't matter if they smile." He refused to eat near the prisoners, refused to laugh. Others whispered that things were getting too soft, that the camp was starting to look like a church picnic instead of a military prison. One sergeant filed a formal complaint after seeing a prisoner and a guard playing cards under the shade of a tree. But the commanding officers, stretched thin and chasing bigger problems, turned their heads. The war in Europe was still burning, but this corner of Texas seemed quiet, contained. And maybe, they reasoned, kindness was cheaper than discipline. If morale stayed high and escape stayed low, what did it matter if the prisoners played guitar? Still, the air held unease. There was a sense that the bubble might burst, that reality might knock on the gates with orders to pack up, ship out, remind everyone which side they were on. But until then, the days rolled on like the prairie wind, slow, sweet, and oddly warm. One prisoner wrote in a letter home, "They treat us like neighbors. We sing, we laugh, we eat more than we did in Italy. I do not know if this is America or a dream." And far beyond the fences, in small towns nearby, rumors began to fly. That the enemy sang songs with their captors, that prisoners were fed better than farmers, that a cowboy was barbecuing for Mussolini's men. It sounded impossible. But inside the camp, it was just another Tuesday. Then, one morning, a new kind of silence settled over the camp. The mail truck had arrived. Red Cross letters, each marked with a foreign stamp, creased and faded from the long journey across oceans and borders. The Italians crowded the yard as the sergeant read out names: Marco, Gianni, Tommaso. One by one, men stepped forward with trembling hands, clutching envelopes like lifelines. The first tear didn't fall until after the letters were opened. Then came the flood. The words inside were fragile and devastating: homes bombed, farms lost, fathers gone, sisters missing, Naples reduced to ash, Florence scarred, Palermo starving. The news fell like artillery, quiet but total. For many, it was the first true reminder that the war still raged on beyond the wire. Here in Texas, the sky stayed impossibly blue, the grass steady underfoot. But in their minds, the smell of smoke wasn't mesquite anymore. It was memory, burnt stone, and fear. One man read aloud in a shaking voice, "Mama boils weeds for soup. The church roof is gone. We have not seen meat since Christmas." He folded the paper, placed it inside his shirt, and stared out at the horizon as if the distance itself were an insult. Suddenly, the camp's comforts began to sting. The soft bread, the warm coffee, the music after supper, all of it felt wrong. Some of the men stopped eating. Others worked twice as hard, hauling lumber or cleaning latrines as if sweat could pay a debt. At night, whispers spread through the barracks. "We are prisoners who live better than free men." Guilt crept into every corner. Even the songs fell quieter, replaced by the scrape of pens on paper as men wrote back home. Though they knew their replies might never reach Italy, Roy noticed the change long before the guards did. On Sunday, when he came to light the smoker, the crowd was smaller. The men ate, but without laughter. He watched them chew mechanically, eyes far away. When he asked what was wrong, no one answered. Finally, Marco, usually the loudest, handed Roy a letter. Roy couldn't read Italian, but he could read grief, the smudged ink, the tears in the paper. He folded it gently, returned it, and said only, "I'm sorry, son." The words sounded useless in the dry Texas air. Still, he cooked. Smoke and silence became their shared language. Each rib passed through the fence was a kind of prayer. The Italians didn't say thank you anymore. They nodded, eyes lowered, as if gratitude itself were too heavy to carry. Some began carving small wooden crosses or drawing pictures of their towns. One man sketched the silhouette of his family standing beside a ruined house and pinned it to the barrack wall. Beneath it, he wrote in shaky English, "Home is gone, but here we live." As summer deepened, the heat turned merciless. The Texas sun pressed down like judgment. Work details left sweat-darkened paths across the fields. The prisoners, though well-fed, began to wilt under the moral weight of their own survival. One night, as cicadas screamed from the trees, Gianni whispered to Roy through the fence, "When this ends, maybe I stay. No Italy left." It wasn't a joke. Others began echoing the same thought in letters to guards and officers. Could they remain even after the war? Could they work the farms, mend fences, build lives under this endless sky? Rumors spread that the Americans might let a few stay. Most dismissed it as fantasy. But hope, once sparked, was hard to smother. A handful of prisoners began learning English more earnestly. Others offered to fix farm equipment for the locals. They said it was barter, but everyone knew it was something deeper, a quiet plea to belong somewhere that hadn't burned. When the next batch of letters arrived, fewer men lined up to open them. Some couldn't bear it again. They preferred the uncertainty to the confirmation of loss. For them, Texas wasn't captivity anymore. It was shelter from the ruin waiting across the ocean. And as Roy loaded more wood into the pit, watching the smoke rise into the darkening sky, he thought of all those letters and the hearts they carried. The war was ending somewhere far away, but here, on this patch of prairie. No one felt free enough to celebrate. That unease took shape one morning in the form of a staff car. Olive green, polished, too clean for Texas dust. It rolled through the camp gates with a sharpness that made the guards straighten their backs and the Italians pause mid-step. A U.S. Army captain stepped out, crisp uniform, mirrored sunglasses, and a clipboard under his arm. His boots were spotless, his face unreadable. The rumor had arrived before he did. Someone from the higher-ups had heard whispers about civilian contact, fraternization, and something about a rancher handing ribs through the wire. An investigation had been ordered. The captain didn't yell. He didn't need to. His questions were precise, his voice clipped. He interviewed every guard, every officer, and finally Roy himself. They sat under the awning of Roy's porch, the captain sweating through his collar while Roy sipped coffee from a tin cup like it was just another Wednesday. "Is it true," the captain asked, "that you've been feeding Italian POWs without authorization?" Roy shrugged. "They're just hungry boys," he said, calm as still water. "You ever seen a man cry over sausage?" The captain didn't laugh. Inside the camp, tension spread like spilled oil. The guards, caught between regulation and reality, avoided eye contact. The Italians went silent. The music stopped. Roy didn't show up that Sunday or the next. Smoke no longer rose beyond the fence. The pit went cold. Then something happened. It started with hushed conversation. Then tools were borrowed. Then ingredients appeared: flour, eggs, salt. Where they came from, no one quite knew. But by the third day, a group of Italians had turned the barracks kitchen into something sacred. One man kneaded dough on a table under the watchful eyes of guards pretending not to see. Another cracked eggs into a bowl, separating yolk from white with a skill that came from home. Someone stoked a fire. By evening, the camp smelled different, not like army stew or dry rations, but like home, real food, a feast. When Roy pulled up in his truck on the fourth day, he found something he never expected: a long wooden table pulled into the open yard, covered with a white cloth. Dozens of Italian men stood around it, clean shirts, solemn eyes. One stepped forward, handed Roy a plate. On it, handmade pasta, steam rising, tomato sauce, thick with garlic and love, a few sprigs of basil. Roy blinked. "This for me?" he asked, voice low. The man nodded. "Grazie, Roy," he said, words slow and careful. "You feed us. Now, we feed you." The guards didn't stop it. Maybe they were just tired. Maybe they understood. The captain, watching from the steps of the administration office, said nothing, just stared through his glasses and took one slow sip from a canteen. The Italians sang that night, not songs of victory or sorrow, but of thanks. One played a fiddle, another beat time on a tin bowl. Roy sat with them, plate in hand, chewing slowly. He didn't speak, didn't have to. His eyes glistened. Later, one of the younger prisoners handed him a folded napkin. Inside was a charcoal drawing of Roy. Cowboy hat tilted, smoke curling behind him, a faint smile on his face. On the back, in shaky handwriting, it read, "In war, we lost everything. In Texas, we found a friend." That night, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, the captain filed his report. It mentioned unauthorized civilian interaction, breach of protocol, minor disciplinary suggestion, nothing more. He left the next morning. Roy showed up again that Sunday, so did the brisket, and nobody stopped him. By then, the fences no longer meant what they used to. They still stood, tall, barbed, and patrolled, but they no longer kept men from being men. They marked space, not hearts. Within those lines of wire and watchtowers, life had begun to take on a rhythm stranger than peace, but softer than war. A liminal world where rules bent just enough to let something human through. It started with a soccer ball. Someone, no one remembered who, had patched one together from rags and twine. On a cloudless afternoon, it rolled into the American side of the yard. A guard picked it up, turned it in his hands, and instead of tossing it back, kicked it. A low, lazy pass. A young Italian soldier ran after it, kicked it back. Within minutes, a game broke out. Two sides, half Italian, half American, laughing, shouting, boots thudding across the dry earth like drums. The guards in the towers didn't stop it. One even whistled the national anthem as a joke. Roy started bringing more than brisket. He brought his old guitar, a few Spanish cigars, a bottle of peach preserves from a neighbor's farm. One Sunday, he swapped hats with Gianni, the wiry prisoner who once fixed his truck's starter coil without being asked. Gianni wore Roy's battered cowboy hat like a crown. In return, he handed over a hand-rolled cigar and grinned. "You smoke like Sicilian now," he said. Roy just chuckled and lit it on the spot. Cultural exchange didn't need diplomacy. It happened through sketches passed under mess hall trays, drawings of cattle, fig trees, hometowns that no longer existed. It happened through recipes traded in gestures and broken words. A pinch of this, stir like that. Some of the guards started asking the prisoners how to make pasta from scratch. One even smuggled in a chunk of Parmesan his wife had sent from back east. He didn't get in trouble. By then, no one was keeping score. Music floated across the yard every night, an accordion rescued from a forgotten storage room, an American fiddle out of tune but joyful. Old Neapolitan ballads bled into Texas folk songs until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. Prisoners taught guards how to waltz. Guards taught prisoners how to two-step. There were no lessons, just motion, just joy. But joy could not stop the war from creeping back in. New orders came down, typed pages, cold words. Command wanted reports, numbers, repatriation plans. The war in Europe was turning. Mussolini had fallen. The Allies were pressing into Italy. The idea that these men, once enemies, might return home soon felt surreal. Some cried at the news, not for joy, for confusion, for dread. One Italian wrote in his diary, "There is more freedom in this camp than in my own country." He wasn't alone in thinking it. Word spread that men would be shipped back within months. Forms were filled, dates circled. The guards grew quiet again. Roy said less. On Sundays he smoked meat with a heaviness in his shoulders. Some of the prisoners began asking questions in hushed tones. Could they stay? Could they work the land? Could they become citizens? A few even joked about marrying local girls. But the jokes had sadness at the edge, like a dog circling a door it couldn't open. Repatriation loomed like a thunderhead, but for now the smoke still curled from Roy's pit. The soccer ball still bounced between boots, and inside the wire that no longer held them truly captive, men from opposite ends of the earth found something rare. Not peace, not home, but something close enough to believe in. And they knew, with the surety of sun and fire, that whatever came next, it would not feel like this again. What came next was a telegram, then another. News spread faster than gunfire. Germany had surrendered. Mussolini was dead. The war, at least in Europe, was over. For most of the world it was a day of flags and music, parades and shouting. But inside the camp the response was quieter. Stunned, hollow. The Italians didn't cheer. They stood in the yard and blinked at the sky. Some crossed themselves. Others just stared at the earth beneath their boots as if it had betrayed them. Soon after, the orders came. Typed, official, no room for interpretation. The Italian prisoners of war were to be processed for repatriation. Those deemed non-essential to reconstruction efforts in the States would be returned to Italy in staggered convoys. Camps would be cleared, barracks emptied. It was time to go home. But to what? The questions burned hotter than Texas sun. Home? Where? Many had none left. Naples was rubble. Sicily was starving. Families scattered or gone. One man held a photograph of a house that no longer existed. Another whispered that his village had been swallowed by retreating German tanks and never seen again. And now, just when they had found a rhythm, a strange new comfort behind enemy fences, they were being told to leave it all. Not everyone agreed. The first petition was written on a wrinkled legal pad, in shaky English and all capital letters. I wish to stay in Texas. I work. I love this land. Others followed. Dozens of prisoners began submitting requests, formal, pleading, desperate. They offered to work the land, to rebuild fences, to dig irrigation lines, to herd cattle for local ranchers. One even wrote directly to Congress. Another signed his letter with a thumbprint, too nervous to spell his name wrong. Roy wrote one, too. His was short, handwritten in pencil and folded twice. It simply said, "These boys ain't prisoners anymore. They're workers, neighbors. We could use more hands around here." He passed it to a guard who passed it up the chain. Whether it ever made it beyond the county line, no one ever knew. But word spread through the camp like gospel. Roy wanted them to stay. A few took things further. One night, under cover of dark, 3 prisoners slipped past the wire, not to escape, but to hide. Roy found them behind his hayloft the next morning, sitting quietly, waiting. They didn't ask for asylum, just work. "We can stay here," one said. "No one will know." Roy sighed, handed them coffee, and told them he'd figure it out. It sparked debate in town. Some folks were furious. "You want to let Mussolini's men live here?" They barked at the town hall. Others defended them. "They're more polite than my own damn nephews," one shopkeeper said. Local papers picked it up. "Prisoners petition for American soil," read the headline in the County Gazette. But bureaucracy didn't care much for sentiment. Approvals were rare. Most were denied. A handful were granted conditional stays, usually to men with specialized skills or those engaged in critical labor. The rest were told to pack what little they had. Trains were coming. Ships waited at port. It was time. The atmosphere shifted again. Bittersweet didn't cover it. Roy smoked one of Johnny's cigars while watching the men sort their belongings, hand-carved wooden tokens, sketches, folded letters tied in twine. He said little. Just worked the pit like always. The fire crackled, meat hissed, and the smoke curled upward like a last goodbye. For the Italians it was a strange morning. They had survived the war, only to feel like they were losing something again. Not freedom, something smaller but no less precious, a rhythm, a friendship, a second chance. And as the trucks began to line up at the edge of camp, they looked at Texas not as captors' land, but as something they might have called home. If only the war had ended sooner. If only borders were as easy to erase as fences. The last night arrived without ceremony. No marching orders, no speeches, just the quiet knowledge that by dawn the trucks would roll and the men who had once been enemies would be gone. The camp felt heavier that evening, as though the air itself resisted the coming separation. Roy stood by the pit he had tended for more than a year, his hands blackened with soot, the fire whispering low. The meat was already on, slow-cooked, patient, perfect. It wasn't celebration anymore. It was farewell. The Italians gathered silently around the flames. No laughter this time, no jokes about bad American coffee or Texas dust. They moved like men at a wake. Gianni approached first, holding a loaf of bread he'd baked from stolen flour and yeast he'd hidden for weeks. "For you," he said softly, offering it to Roy with both hands. Roy took it without words. He didn't need any. The bread was still warm. They ate together as stars began to bloom overhead. Someone found an old guitar and strummed it half-heartedly. The melody wavered in the wind, uncertain, fragile. Then another voice joined in, singing in Italian, low, trembling, beautiful. It was a song of departure, a hymn of ships and homecomings, of men who leave and never return quite the same. Even the guards stopped their patrols to listen. The firelight flickered across faces streaked with sweat and tears. Roy passed around plates piled high with brisket, ribs, and beans. The smoke hung heavy, sweet with mesquite and memory. Each man ate slowly, reverently, as though tasting something sacred. They weren't just eating meat. They were eating time, the last meal of an impossible peace. Across from the fire, Marco carved small wooden tokens from scraps of cedar, handing them out like blessings. Each bore a name, a date, or a simple cross. Tommaso, who had once fixed Roy's truck, handed him a folded letter. "You keep," he said, "for when you forget us." Roy smiled faintly. "Ain't much chance of that." The unspoken gratitude filled every pause. They had no speeches to give, no medals to offer, only what their hands could make. Bread, carvings, sketches, a few notes of a song carried on smoke. One man slipped a small envelope into Roy's coat pocket when he wasn't looking. Inside was a photograph, creased and faded, showing a young man standing in front of a vineyard. On the back, in shaky English, it read, "When I go home, I will tell them America smells like barbecue." When the plates were empty and the fire began to die, silence fell again. The guards shifted uneasily, knowing dawn was near. Roy poured the last of his coffee onto the coals. The hiss sounded like the closing of a door. Then, without a word, one of the prisoners stepped forward. He held a rosary, small, wooden, worn smooth by years of touch. Without speaking, he tied it to the fence post nearest Roy's truck. It swayed gently in the night breeze, glinting faintly in the firelight. No one asked why. Everyone understood. It was a symbol of what had been left behind, not just faith, but belonging. A reminder that even behind barbed wire, humanity had survived. As the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Roy lingered by the pit, staring at the rosary through the fence. He could still smell the smoke on his clothes, still hear the echo of their song. When the first pale light of morning crept over the prairie, the trucks arrived. Engines grumbled. The men loaded their bags, boarded quietly, heads bowed. Roy tipped his hat as each one passed. No one said goodbye. And when the last truck rolled away, the fence stood empty, the rosary the only thing left moving in the wind. Time passed like weather on the plains, slow, subtle, steady. Seasons came and went. Grass grew tall where boots once marched. The fence rusted. The barracks were torn down. But the stories remained. At first, they lived in whispers, in barber shops, diners, and church basements. Then they were told more boldly, passed from one generation to the next. "You know," an old-timer would say, nodding toward the edge of town, "that's where the prisoners lived, and didn't want to leave." Some of the Italians did return, not as captives but as immigrants. One, Marco, came back in 1952 with his wife and baby daughter, stepping off a train with a suitcase full of hope and a heart still warmed by Texas fire. Another, Gianni, returned in the 60s, gray now, slower, but with the same crooked grin. He never said much. Just showed up once a year and left flowers at a grave marked Roy Lancer, 1898 to 1965, he fed the hungry. Roy had passed quietly, the way he'd lived. No parade, no headlines, just a worn hat left on a peg and a fire pit gone cold. The locals buried him on a gentle slope near the edge of his land, facing the sunrise. And every spring, without fail, a few strange names would appear in the visitor's log. Italians, men with lined faces and eyes that glistened when they saw the old mesquite tree still standing. The pit itself sat untouched for years. Grass grew around it. Weeds sprouted from the cracks. But no one ever tore it down. It became a kind of landmark. Children were warned not to play too close to it. "That's sacred ground," their grandparents would whisper. Some claimed they could still smell smoke on certain evenings when the wind blew just right. In the town, the story transformed. What had been memory turned into myth. School teachers mentioned it in passing. "Once, during the war," they'd begin, "there was a cowboy who fed the enemy." The children listened wide-eyed, not quite believing. But then someone would point to the fence post, still there, still holding that weathered rosary, bleached pale by sun and rain. A symbol, a relic. Proof that it had all happened. Roy's name became shorthand for a kind of quiet rebellion. A few locals called him a hero, not for killing, but for refusing to hate. His old truck rusted in a barn until someone restored it and drove it in the town parade every 4th of July. Not everyone cheered, but most did. As for the Italians, those who stayed or returned made lives. They opened bakeries, ran ranches, taught their children both languages. Some never spoke of the war again. Others told their stories to anyone who would listen. About the cowboy with a limp, the Sunday brisket, the soccer matches behind barbed wire. They told of a land that had held them gently when the world had torn them apart. And in the quiet corners of Texas, in kitchens filled with garlic and mesquite, songs were still sung in 2 languages, lullabies from Naples beside hymns from Amarillo, a fusion of sorrow and survival, of distance and return. The camp was long gone, the men were old, but somewhere between the fence posts and the fire pit the truth endured, that once, in the heart of war, something like peace was cooked slowly over wood and flame, and the men who tasted it never forgot.